Now, the war between Israel and Hamas has long troubled international experts when it comes to the laws of proportion. Now, according to the current estimate by Israeli army, 2 Gazans have been killed for every Hamas militant. A former British Army commander explained the current proportion in Israel and Hamas war, with other wars and conflicts.
The IDF are currently estimating civilian to combatant casualty ratios in this war at around 2 to 1. That means 2 civilians killed for every fighter killed. By comparison, the UN estimates that the civilian to combatant death ratio in conflicts since the Second World War averages 9 civilians to every combatant. In Iraq, estimates suggest US forces killed 3 civilians for every combatant, and in Afghanistan, between 3 and 5 to 1. In previous conflicts in Gaza, the IDF has achieved a significantly more favourable casualty ratio, generally between 0.6 to 1 and 2 to 1. It's still awful, but much better than most, if not all, other armies engaged in combat.
Earlier, IDF spokesperson called the ratio of killings in Gaza, quote, positive. However, this received a backlash from the United Nations. Over 16,200 have been killed in Gaza since the outbreak of the war, while over 1,200 people were killed in Israel. Now, the October 7th terror attack launched by Hamas in southern Israel shocked the world and was condemned globally. But ever since, Israel attacks raised concerns over the loss of lives. Several critics have criticized the Netanyahu government for the ongoing conflict as they compare the death toll of previous conflicts between Israel and Palestine with the current war. Much of the north of Gaza has been reduced to rubble. Over 1.9 million people have been displaced towards the south. This comprises over 80% of the population. Hospitals, refugee camps, schools and places of worship, all the places have come under Israeli bombardment in Gaza. Eylon Levy is the current Israeli government spokesperson and former international media advisor to the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog, is now joining us live from Tel Aviv. Sir, it's great to have you with us again. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
The most pressing question from me tonight is about the lives being lost in the Gaza Strip. What is Israel doing to minimize civilian deaths? And do you think the Israeli government is doing enough, really, on that front?
It truly is tragic to think that everyone who has been killed since Hamas declared war on October 7th would still be alive if Hamas had not declared war against the people of Israel and decided to wage that war from inside densely populated areas. Civilian fatalities are a tragic feature of every war, and they're a tragic feature of this war that Hamas launched on us. Now, Israel has been making unprecedented efforts in order to minimize civilian casualties and get civilians out of harm's way. We have officers making personal phone calls to residents of Gaza, telling them to evacuate from areas that are going to get dangerous because Hamas has embedded itself under civilian areas. Our soldiers have been securing humanitarian corridors for Palestinians to evacuate. We've released a precise map showing an almost block-by-block basis so that we can get people out of areas where Hamas has embedded itself under their infrastructure. And we also opened a hotline, a human shield hotline, a phone number that Palestinians who are being held as human shields by Hamas can call to tell our army that Hamas isn't allowing them to escape. Because Hamas's whole strategy, it's really sick and difficult to believe, but Hamas's strategy is based on hiding behind women and children so that it can attack our women and children and then evade justice. And in this war that Hamas declared on October 7th, we're doing everything to thwart that strategy, to get civilians out of harm's way so that we can target the terror infrastructure that Hamas has built under their homes and bring to justice the monsters responsible for the October 7th massacre.
Sir, it's good that you've mentioned all that and you've outlined all that, because we'll go one by one after all that information that you've given us today. Sir, we all agree that the October 7th terror attacks were horrifying. 1,200 lives were lost, and Hamas should be condemned for that. But how do you justify the deaths of over 16,200 Palestinians?
The atrocities of October 7th were the deadliest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust and the worst terror attack in world history after 9/11. And the first thing that Hamas did after brutally massacring 1,200 people and abducting 240 hostages was to tell us that it wants to do it all over again. Hamas leaders are openly saying they want to perpetrate more October 7th massacres, as many as it takes to murder every man, woman, child in this country. So we're fighting now not only to defend ourselves from the October 7th massacre, we're fighting to prevent any such massacres from happening again. And if anyone thinks that this war is going to end with us abandoning our hostages in Gaza and leaving the monsters who want to perpetrate another October 7th massacre in power, then they have another thing coming. Because we have an obligation. The first obligation of every state is to keep its people safe. Hamas declared war on us. We didn't want this war or start this war or expect this war. Hamas declared war on us, and we are fighting to defend ourselves. We're doing everything we can to get civilians on the other side out of harm's way to safety. And everyone who has been hurt, everyone who has been killed in this war since October 7th, the responsibility lies squarely with the army of terror that launched this war, that started this war, and that chose to fight this war from inside densely populated areas. It is Hamas that bears full responsibility for all the suffering we've seen.
But sir, an Israeli spokesperson said that for every Hamas militant, 2 civilians have died. Does that statement, for a moment, sound right to you? And how is Israeli IDF and government making this assertion? Or rather, how are you coming to these conclusions?
That is not an official estimate, but we know that we have killed thousands of Hamas terrorists. We know, for example, that we have killed half of their battalion commanders, because the purpose of this war is to go after the monsters who perpetrated the October 7th massacre. This is a counter-terrorism war in dense, populated urban areas. Just like the West fought wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and to defeat ISIS when 86 nations came together to destroy ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And as we heard from your guest just earlier, in every war, in every counterterrorism war, tragically, it's horrific, civilians are killed. And that ratio is usually very high in terms of the civilian to combatant ratio. And because we are making unprecedented efforts that no army in history has made to keep civilians safe, we've managed to drive down that ratio way down, so that when the fog of war clears and you look at what the civilian to combatant ratio is, it will compare very favorably to other counterterrorism wars fought in urban areas. We didn't start this war. We didn't want this war. Hamas declared this war on us. And in this awful, awful situation, we're doing the best we can, everything we can, going above and beyond our obligations under international law to keep civilians safe. That's why we're being targeted. It's why we're being precise. And it's why we're going after the monsters who perpetrated the October 7th massacre while going out of our way to get civilians out of harm's way.
All right, talking about getting civilians out of harm's way, my final question to you, and please make the response a little bit brief. Sir, you say that Hamas has now entrenched itself with the civilians in south of Gaza. It was the same case in the north. I'm curious, how does the military differentiate between Hamas and innocent civilians? And is the Israeli government even listening to these aid agencies like the United Nations or the World Health Organization, who say the situation is getting worse by the hour?
It's difficult to distinguish between combatants and civilians because Hamas doesn't play by the rules. Hamas fighters dress up as civilians and they hide inside schools, hospitals, mosques and people's homes, and they make it very difficult. But we take our obligations under international law very seriously, and so we continue to distinguish. On the basis of very precise evidence, we know where their commanders are. Our soldiers are engaged in close face-to-face fighting against Hamas terrorists. So we distinguish between civilians and terrorists. We go after the terrorists. We try to get civilians out of harm's way. And we're doing what we can to increase the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza, of food, of water, of medicines, and of shelter, because we want aid to go to the civilians who need it, while making sure that Hamas cannot steal it.
Eylon Levy is the current Israeli government spokesperson and former international media advisor to the President of Israel, Isaac Herzog. Eylon, thank you, as always, for talking to us today.
Thank you.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.